So let's talk about like himma or aspiration, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think the first person that comes to mind when we talk about aspiration is obviously Sultan Mehmed II, right?
In some ways, why Fatih is exceptional though. I mean, he's a young guy who's part of a worldview in which people forget there are many people converting to Islam
At that time.
at that time, right? Because the Ottomans, which is conquered the Balkans and so forth, and people forget this, that the drive towards Constantinople predominantly is this new group of Muslims who are surrounding Fatih, who are driven to saying we can do this, and there is a particular zeal.
So new converts. The new convert zeal.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Assalamu alaikum, and welcome to another episode of Sultans and Sneakers. I'm your host, as always, Mahin the podcaster, and on today's episode, I welcome back my dear friend, Dr. Yakoob Ahmed, visiting us from Istanbul, and you brought yourself a new hat.
Actually, firstly, Assalamu alaikum, and I didn't bring myself a new hat. You actually presented this to me, which I really appreciate, because as we spoke about the last time, for your viewers who don't know, I commented on a cool hat that you were wearing, and then you've had this custom made for me, which I really appreciate. And even the title, Kizil Elma, has a strong connection to Istanbul and the Ottoman Empire and the Turkish Republic. So this is really cool. I don't want people to think this is a Make America Great Again hat. This is specific to the Ottoman Empire. So I really appreciate it.
Right, and I think it's funny because you have to request the Turkic script somehow. What I do is there's a company called Hood Hat. They don't sponsor. Hood Hat, if you're listening though, I'm down. I buy a lot. Like I got myself a little Palestine hat, because I gotta buy one get one special with yours. So, you're not the second person that I know of that has that hat. Me being the first, right? But I think Hood Hat needs to hey, they didn't come correct.
This is really cool. I'm well impressed, and especially I think there's a tendency in human beings, but maybe some more than others, where they like the idea of having things which are unique. Which are personalized and so forth, and personalized gifts tend to make people feel a lot more important.
Doc, yes, your mic's over there. Okay, I just check. Keep an eye on the blueness.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, for sure. You got it. All right. So I want to dive right into it because there's several things I want to cover with you.
Okay.
When we spoke, we were speaking last week before your trip here, and the show's about personal development and for Muslim men and all that. And I was like, what angle can I take with Dr. Yakoob? So, there's a scene from the TRT serial Payat Abdul Hamid,
right? Which
I'm not sure if you've seen the clip or not, but there's a scene when the Sultan's there with his right hand man Tassin Pasha, and a businessman comes to visit him, and they said he owes the Sultan owes him some debt, so they finally Sultan's let him in. He comes in, he's like, my Sultan, I'm a businessman, I went bankrupt. And every night before I go to sleep, I ask Allah to relieve me of my debts. And then Tassin Pasha interrupts him, and he's like, what does it have to do with the Sultan? And then he keeps going. He's like, last night, in my dream, I saw the Prophet ﷺ in my dream. And he told me, the Sultan Ar-Hamid makes salawat upon me every day, every night. But last night he did not. Go and ask from him your debt. And then the Sultan froze. Right. And he was like, what did he say? And he said, Ar-Hamid said, and he said, stop. And he pulls out a bag of coins and gives it to him. And then he takes it. And then the guy looks up and the Sultan says, say it again. He's like, Ar-Hamid said. And he does it 3 or 4 times. And finally, Tassin Pasha is like, my son, haven't you taken enough from him? And then the businessman says, yeah, this is sufficient. This will pay off all my debts. And then he walked out. And so Tassin Pasha looks at the Sultan Abdul Hamid and is like, Your Majesty, I was fearful that he was going to take everything you had. Right. Like all your money, all your wealth. Right. And the Sultan said, what did you say, Pasha? Yeah. By Allah, if he had asked me for my entire kingdom, I would have given it to him. Last night I was working late and I fell asleep before I could do my salawat. May Allah forgive me. So, with that being said, I go through the comment section. People are inspired to read salawat now, and there's talks about there's comments about these were our rulers of the past. But let me ask you this, Doc: is this a historical fiction, or is there truth to this Like, not the exact story, but like this spirituality, this connection that Sultan Abdul Hamid had.
Okay, bismillah. So one of the interesting things about Western historiography, in particular in the way that they wrote it, was this idea. It wasn't just the Western academics, but even Ibn Khaldun makes this case about the historian should frame the imagination and the narrative that they construct to some degree based on evidence. Right?
Yep.
Whereas fictional writers have a lot more agency in that sense. Now, even fictional writers, they have to work within a particular believable paradigm for people to accept what they're saying. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is because Paikat Abdul Hamid is a fictional show. In that sense, the possibilities of the directors, the producers, and the people behind the show using a lot more of their creative imagination to construct this scene, because nobody was there in reality. I have Tahsin Pasha's memoirs. My memory doesn't serve me well, but I'm not sure if that narrative is in there or written in that way, which means that it's the agency or the ability for the show creators to be a lot more creative is clearly expressed here. Having said that, it is known that Sultan Abdul Hamid was very pious. It is known that Sultan Abdul Hamid, for example, one of the legends we hear is in terms of wudu, which is that Sultan Abdul Hamid was always in the state of wudu, and even when he was asleep, he would have like a stone that when he woke up in the morning, he did tayammum before he went and did wudu. So he always wanted to be in the state of being mutawadda in that sense. So there's a lot of things like this, and it's clear that Abdul Hamid in particular had an exceptional love for Rasulullah. This is also well known from what we hear in regards to some of the ulama and members of the tariqat. So in that sense, it's understandable why it's believable that Sultan Abdul Hamid would have done something like that. But can we categorically say that that happened in the way that it happened? I think there is some creative imagination being used there. But Abdul Hamid is known of having that type of personality, and the ummah, the contemporary ummah at least, have an imagination of Abdul Hamid. And that's why that scene is believable, because they also are aware of Abdul Hamid in that sense, and that's how that sort of worked. And I'm assuming the writers of the show also recognized that and were able to present Abdul Hamid in that fashion.
Sure. Now, the target audience of the serial are the Turks, correct?
Yeah.
Right? It's funny because if I had seen this scene 15, 20 years ago, or if I had shown someone who was more of a Salafi orientation, automatically there's like skepticism. It's not a thing of like why, that doesn't, you get what I'm saying.
Yeah.
It goes without saying. You don't have to really explain why that would be the case. Yeah. With that being said, it seems to me, like we were talking offline, the Turks never had this kind of Wahhabi Salafi influence that really permeated their culture.
Right. Yeah, there's many layers to why that's happened. As we mentioned. So, or as we discussed, the first layer of it is that when the sort of like reformist trend of Salafism, which emerges in predominantly the Arab world at the time, so people are aware of like Muhammad Abdul, Sheikh Rashid Rida, and so forth. But it's not just in of those people. There's the Qasimi brothers, there's Al-Qawaqibi, and so forth. There are many thinkers who are part of this like new intellectual wave, if you want to call it that, of reform and Islah that emerges in the 19th century. Because one of the things that we were talking about yesterday in the masjid is the 19th century is an indication in the Muslim world in particular of how do we try to address what's taking place in regards to colonialism and sort of like Western European supremacy.
Right.
So Islah as an idea emerges in the 18th and 19th century more so. And that's how you get the sort of reformist Salafist movements, the Wahhabi movements, the Naqshbandi movement and so forth, right? And so the early Ottoman Empire was really careful in regards to dealing with specifically the Wahhabi and the reformist Salafist movements that were emerging in the Arabic-speaking world, to make sure that it didn't penetrate the sort of like Balkan and Anatolian space. And one of the reasons for that is a critique on the sultanic framing of the political order.
Sure.
The second thing is the critique on hierarchy of the ulama. and the second, which was part of the culture and the order of the day and the idea of hierarchy. And then as an extension of that, the notion of madahibs, and then as an extension of that, taqlid in of itself, which for the first time became a sort of like, taqlid was reflected as an ideology perhaps, where you would say that these people are, it was used in a term to critique society by saying they were taqlidis.
Sure.
This has never happened before. Initially, taqlid was just a concept of fiqh,
Right.
but now it's being used in a more everyday fashion to critique society. So the early Ottomans sort of were really careful in Istanbul not to allow this sort of idea to penetrate Anatolia in the Balkans. Now, after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish Republic, for different reasons, for its sort of like positions, anti-Arab positions, formations and so forth, the emergence of the Saudi state and whatnot, then they didn't want that type of those types of ideologies to make their way into the Turkish Republic. So they fashioned a new way of indigenizing Islam in Turkey in accordance to the Turkish identity.
Right.
And then, as years have gone by, in Turkey in particular, that there is a pride in the sense of the way that they practice Islam, the sort of scholarly tradition that they've established, and so forth. And so there's still been this sort of distance regarding Salafism and Wahhabism and so forth. So there's been many reasons of why Turkey hasn't accepted this sort of thinking.
Could we also say that because they felt their Dr. Sherman Jackson says that like when religion fails to be relevant, religion disappears. Could we say that the religion always was relevant to the Turks, at least their as how they perceived it?
I think religion has continuously been relevant in the region by and large. It's just for the Turks, they had a different mechanism in the way of understanding religion.
Okay.
I mean, look, the loss of Ottoman Turkish is a huge body blow, and then the extraction of Arabic as well.
Sure.
And so when you take away two main languages, two components of the way that you identify yourself vis-a-vis Islam, and then you have to refashion again, you can understand why the Turkish Republic and the Muslims within it become quite insular in regards to being inward-looking within the space that they have, and then want to sort of like be able to fashion a language of Islam that works for the conditions that they have at the time.
Sure. Did Sultan Abdul Hamid himself have like a spiritual path, like a tariqah that he followed?
Not one specific tariqah. So Abdul Hamid was quite different from his father Abdul Majid and his uncle Abdul Aziz, in the sense that they were both very heavily inspired by the Naqshbandi tariqat. Abdul Hamid was a little bit different. He actually was a lot more pluralistic in his support for many types of tariqats. There were some tariqats that he frequented more than others, like the Shadli tariqat, the Naqshbandis and so forth. But he was still a lot more pluralistic in his support for tariqat culture overall.
Sure.
And I think one of the reasons that could have been the case is because of the sort of like agency and dominance that the Naqshis attained in the 19th century, where the Naqshis didn't believe in being in power, but they did have a belief of influencing the elites of society as a way of socially engineering society and bringing them to the path of Quran and Sunnah, which they believed in. And Abdul Hamid was a little bit more wary of allowing one tariqat to have that level of dominance over the political structure.
Right.
But also, I think Abdul Hamid, maybe perhaps, and this is just my own guesswork here, was that he wasn't necessarily of the belief that this tariqat is more right than that tariqat, but willing to understand that they all lead to some path to the truth, and so he was willing to engage with quite a few tariqat oriented
So he
people.
himself didn't necessarily have a specific sheikh that he had a bay'ah to.
There were some sheikhs that he did frequent to more often than others.
Okay.
But once again, it wasn't one specific sheikh, it was a group of them. So, for example, we know that Abu Huda al-Sayyadi from Bilad al-Sham was somebody that was close to Sultan Abdul Hamid II in that sense, and Abdul Hamid confided in him. Yusuf al-Nabahani, once again, was another sheikh that Abdul Hamid was close to. And what's interesting is actually, during the time of Sultan Abdul Hamid, that there was a closeness of...
And Sheikh Yusuf al-Nabahani, he was Arab, wasn't he?
Yeah, absolutely. So he was. This is what I was about to say. Both of them. There was a... Abdul Hamid had invited a lot of shuyukh from the Arab world into his close circle.
Okay.
For sure.
Sure. So now going back to the beginning of we look at some of the figures in the beginning, right? There's a lot of tropes about the Ottomans and fratricide, and one ruler takes over and then he just has the brothers just killed like all at once. So if I read correctly, the succession of Osman Ghazi, he had what, 2 sons, Orhan and Alauddin, correct?
Right.
Or did he have more than 2 sons?
I'm not sure, but Alauddin and Orhan are the 2 that we clearly do know of.
What do we know about that they didn't have like a power struggle? There was like they were able to work together. What do we know about? Do we know anything about Osman's parenting, how they were raised, and why Orhan and Alauddin like necessarily didn't engage in fratricide?
So the simple answer to that question is we don't have that information.
Okay.
In actuality, so in what we learn in what a lot of people watch Ottoman and so forth is that earlier period, and I always use Sirah as an example, is that when we're reading Sirah, the early part of Rasulullah's life before he was given revelation, the documentation and evidence is a lot less.
Yeah.
It increases as Rasulullah's popularity increases and the message of Islam becomes a lot more dominant in the region. And so by the time you get to Badr, Uhud and so forth, there's a lot more documentation taking place, right? So that's a similar case in the Ottoman Empire. With that early part of the Ottoman period, there's a lot less documentation in some ways, mainly because there are other principalities that are a lot more dominant and powerful that are known in the region over the Ottomans in that sense. But what is important, and I think I mentioned this to you before, is what we do see in terms of the culture of the early Ottomans is not necessarily the information regarding how father had raised his children, but how shuyukh and ulama were continuously around the family and how the family were being shaped by these shuyukh to think in a particular way. And I think that's really important for people to appreciate because sometimes they miss this, which is there wasn't an emphasis in that sense on the nuclear family in the way that we understand it as Muslims today. I mean, fundamentally, I don't think Muslims have ever understood the family in that way because in Islam you can have more than one wife. It's a village, multiple children with multiple wives, aunts, uncles, and so forth, right? This is the mechanism that Muslims understood. So a child was raised by multiple people in that way, and that was a lot more wholesome in that sense. Whereas today it would be one partner in a small apartment and the child, and then send them to school and whatnot. There's lots of dislocation that's taking place here, from the parents being dislocated from their family, from their village, from their culture, to the child being dislocated from the parents providing in schooling and so forth, right? But what we notice in the early Ottoman period, anyway, is there is a culture that's conducive towards people of wisdom being around the community and of people of power. And so, in that sense, I would be very interested, and I think the way I'm leaning in terms of my own understanding of this, is that people like Orhan Ghazi and so forth, and we know the stories of Osman Ghazi and his sheikh, Edebali and so forth, is that you see that they were really influential in shaping this leadership culture.
Sure. I mean, I'm asking kind of as a from a father to a non-father, so you're talking about theoretical here. Like, do you see opportunities for us here in America? Like, because we don't have that. You alluded to, we don't have that kind of expanded family, right?
Right.
You know, you can't talk about polygamy without getting canceled,
right?
But as far as like having, like mashayikh around your families and stuff like that, have you seen examples of that working from your own observations? Is that something that you think? What are elements do you think that we could adopt in our modern day-to-day lives as we raise our own children?
So I was having a conversation today about the idea that Eli Isab Bovich in particular made the case that.
And can you explain who he is, just for anyone who's not familiar?
Yeah, so he was a Bosnian intellectual, and then he became, I think, the prime minister or the president of Bosnia in that sense. And he's a huge, like, giant in terms of a thinker in the Muslim world. In that sense, he was also a mujahid in many ways. He fought on the side of the Bosnians, and an exceptional thinker. And one of the things that he writes about in his work about civilizational Islam as a civilization from east to west, his book, he talks about the differentiation between the big city and the village. And he alluded to the idea that in the village, people tend to hold on to religion a lot tighter than the big city. And his critique of the big city was that people become fractured as communities. And this is not just him. You can see in the case of Naqib al-Attas in Malaysia, who's another exceptional Muslim thinker, who also explains how the sort of like urbanization practices of the big city, of the metropolises, create a particular sense of distance amongst people, right? And even the Algerian thinker Malik bin Nabi talks about this in Civilizational Moments, about how big cities are in some ways reflections of the sort of like modern colonial sort of like methodologies that we are the sum of individuals. In that sense, we are victims to the big city, the metropolis, in that way. And that can be a little bit problematic for us. Now, the reason why I mentioned the village and the big city, because in the village, at least most Muslim countries, there is still a semblance of this in villages, although that's also changing because of modernity, is that there are collective structures of safeguarding people, and there are people of wisdom in those cities. It could be an aunt, it could be an uncle, it could be the man in the mosque, and so forth. And the communities take a responsibility of also sort of like regulating the behaviors of the community. Whereas in the big city, we absolve ourselves from that. We'll say, we're just going to close our eyes, put our heads down, keep moving, and let the authorities deal with that. And so what happens is you do get compartmentalized as that sort of individual. Now, what I've seen in my case of reading history in particular is that people of wisdom in our communities really have helped shape the community. Now, what we are doing, unfortunately, is we're putting the agency back onto the husband and wife. You guys figure it out and deal with it. And I just think that Islam doesn't point us in that direction because it's not feasible to do that. It's unnatural for us. So even with the issue of parents today talking about homeschooling and so forth, they're concerned about how do we educate our kids and so forth, because they're concerned about the educational systems of the state. But that's a middle upper class project. Most Muslims can't do that. What we need to do is find a way of creating communal forms of learning and knowledge and interaction, actually. We need to create communities. So in the case of the United Kingdom, I was listening to somebody recently saying, that the Muslim communities don't pay attention much to the converts who are becoming Muslim. And I was thinking and thought to myself, but do we function in the traditional sense of community here? To some degree, we are a reflection of Western society because we live in it. But we still have a imagination of this reality that we're a community. But we're a very fractured community in many ways. We don't operate in the traditional sense of the community, where everybody knows each other, people are going to each other's homes, they gather together. Apart from Eid and Jum'ah, it's still there's a lot of distance. So even here in Chicago, to get from one Muslim's house to another, you have to drive from one end to another and so on, right? That, I don't think, is something that Islam historically has lent towards. And so it's not just the absence of teachers, it's the way that we are following a pattern which has been constructed for the West, but it's now being superimposed upon us.
And I think you still find that problem in the Muslim lands. If you like if I go to Dhaka, like where I'm from, Bangladesh, right? Like Dhaka is with traffic and congestion. It's going to take, if I go from my aunt's place to my uncle's place, it might take an hour for like 3 miles.
Absolutely.
So they're just not seeing each other that often, right?
Absolutely. And this is why I think Eli Isab Bovich's idea of the village and the city is interesting here, because I think he's recognizing that it's not an issue of Muslim and non-Muslim world. It's the idea that the modern predicament that we're in, that the major metropolis is doing this to us. Now, I've been born and raised in the major metropolis. Like, if you take me out and put me into a village, I start struggling. But what I can say to you is that when I have been in the villages around the Muslim world, there's a particular warmth in the communities, which I really do miss, which I haven't seen replicated in the big city because it can't do that. And life is always fast, and we're all moving, and we're all working, and we're all outsourcing, and so on.
Yeah.
And so to some degree, I do believe that maybe perhaps, one, Muslims need to start to rethink, if they want some form of tranquility in the way that they live, that they really need to look at how we're living in the big city. Two, I think that Muslims really need to have a better understanding of their relationship with nature. I think this is totally missing in us. And I hate to say this, but even in Chicago, we were just in a neighborhood which was predominantly white, and they had greenery and trees, and they were thinking of, you can see for them, part of their urban understanding was a way of accommodating nature to some degree. So we're not being stuck in these large high rises and ghettos and so forth. And the last thing is I really do believe that we need to think of a way of trying to create spaces where we're not isolated from not just us, but the wider community, and that we create communal spaces where there are multiple peoples of wisdom who can support us as a community, as a collective.
Right. Some people think that the quick solution is, we spoke about Hijra briefly last time you were on the podcast. So people think because they're wrestling with this problem.
Certainly.
They've thrown around the idea of Hijra. My wife and I talk about it sometimes too, because there's like fiqh positions. Is it wajib? Is it something? Or if you find your deen is protected here in these lands, it's fine to stay. She always tells me one thing though, that like in Chicago, because she actually was raised here before she was before she was 10 and she moved away. But there's a strong, like from our Bangladeshi community, like that, even though we live far, there is that strong like relationship. Like there's always like, people are always in touch, right?
Yeah.
Secondly, as well, where we live in our neighborhood is called Little Palestine. Shout out like Bridgeview. This is my hat, right? Like I'm kind of reflecting on my girls and my daughters are being raised there, right? And I feel like there is that where you've got like my 5-year-old, her pre-K principal was the first pre-K teacher for my 10-year-old.
Right.
Then she became the principal. Right. So she's seen all three of them. And then she's always been looking out for all three. She always asks like, "Oh, how's Hadia doing? She's 10 now." Like, "Oh, she's like, So there is that, because there's stability within that, right? When I think kids need stability too, right? So sometimes it's like, and I think I'm like, well, sometimes she's right, because I hear about people who like they make hijra to like, I don't know, like somewhere in the Muslim world, and then they feel like they lost their community feel. Yeah,
so this is quite interesting. There's many layers to the sort of like question and comment that you made that maybe I'll try to break down if I can remember. The issue of hijra is it's a sort of like reflection of a sentiment in the feeling of the dislocation Muslims feel in the West, and then you can see that dislocation on occasions can also feel amplified when they go to the Muslim world. And that's the predicament we're in, because in the modern world, we have been strongly made to identify to the countries that we were born in or have a passport to, or whatnot. And that's very unnatural to the human being. Well, historically, human beings have never done that. So that type of sense of loyalty, which is to strip you away from your loyalty to Islam or religion, and to make the loyalty to the place that you live in as being more important, to the point that you champion a form of patriotism and nationalism, left the Muslim very traumatized and dislocated in that sense. And so when there are particular difficulties in the West, especially at moments where Islamophobia is increasing, the sort of like criticism, and now with what's happening in Palestine and so forth, you can see why the Muslim is feeling agitated and assuming that if we went to the Muslim world, this would be a lot more familiar. But you can't undo years of cultural sort of like internalization. You're born and raised in a particular place. Even if it's negative, you still are familiar with it. When you go to the Muslim world, it becomes quite unfamiliar very quickly. When India and Pakistan, when the partition happened, many Muslims migrated to Pakistan, and within 1 year they wanted to migrate back to India. This is very natural for the human being to try to feel that they want to be connected to something which is that they understand, because hijra is to some degree quite jarring. And so that's what happens when they go to the Muslim world. The sort of like sentiment and imagination that they have, and then the reality kicking in, creates that sort of another type of stress.
Yeah.
And it requires, and Allah Ta'ala makes it very clear in the Quran that this is why hijra for him, he tells us how difficult it is, and then like the rewards he gives us for it. So anyone who wants to do that has to recognize it's going to be tough. All right, now, what does this require then? This requires, to some degree, maybe, whether the question is hijra or not, a deeper question, which is that how do we internalize the challenges that we face in the world today? And in that sense, some Muslims might believe and feel that they can run away from a problem and everything will be okay. not anticipating another place will have different problems. So what they might want to do is introspect a little bit and really ask themselves what's going on. Now, I understand why people want to make hijrah, because to some degree, the environments that you're in are also helpful, right? And you just mentioned that community here. And what I've noticed in the West, because we are minorities to some degree, although we haven't been able to fashion the idea of being a millah or qawm, which is what you see in the Muslim world, but we have become communal in the sense that we're a lot smaller. So we do activities like the Jummah and the Eid and so forth, where there's a feeling, at least in our minds, that we belong to this tight-knit community. And so when you go to the Muslim world and the belonging of Ummah is a lot more meta, it's a lot larger, where you're not going to get that everyday feeling.
Right.
The distance is there. Now, this sounds quite strange because initially I said there's no sense of community here, right? The sense of community in the Muslim world, although it's quite meta, but on the day-to-day, your neighbor knows who you are. Somebody will come and give you sugar and so forth. And so it really comes down to how we're understanding, on the one hand, the inclusivity and the exclusivity of the notion of community. So I would say for me in the West, for example, in Britain, that on the one hand, the notion of community in the sense of them knowing me or my everyday life is quite distant. But in the sense of doing acts as a community, like Eid, like Jummah, like multiple other, like Ramadan, and fasting together and being invited to iftars and so forth, that's an intense experience that sometimes you may not feel in the Muslim world. And so that's why I think people subscribe to it.
You know, something you said reminds me of, there's a recent YouTube channel that's been doing quite well. It's basically an American mom. It's called Mama for Vlogs or something. She's from the greater Philadelphia, Pennsylvania area. She's Caucasian American. She just got up and moved with her two younger kids to Rabat.
Right.
And she loves it. She's been there for about a year or so, a little over a year. So she's got she's kind of vlogging her experience there, and she's like, "I'm never going to leave. Why would I go back to America?" Because I think the one thing she talks about is like, "Oh, our neighbors gave us like these cookies." It's always that like day-to-day experience. Like everyone knows you. This is the. So I think that just reminded me of that. You know.
Yeah, I mean, look, I've been living in Istanbul for 10 years, or Turkey in 10 years, and in some ways, Istanbul is still very similar to the large metropolis city of any other city in the world, right? It's very fast-paced. It's exhausting. I go out to buy bread. By the time I come home, I'm shattered. What's going on, right? But on the other hand, the multiple masajids, my neighbors know who I am. You know, I have personal relationships with my vet, with the local guy in the shop, the guy I buy bread from, and so forth. There is a sense of you feel valued by people who don't know you, but then still know you, right? And it sounds strange, but when I leave Turkey to travel somewhere, and then I come back, and there's a local guy who makes kebab, and he'll go, "Oh, where have you been for the last 2 weeks?" I said, "Oh, you noticed? Yeah, we haven't seen you walking by." So there is that, and it's interesting. But each place has its own challenges. I think the advice I give anyone, whether they want to stay or go, is not to have a nostalgic understanding in that sense, and recognize that even though the Muslim world is a trade-off, and it just comes down to what type of trade-off you're willing to make and what sort of hardship you're willing to go through. And for example, if you're born and raised in the West and you've become acclimatized to this type of challenge, then you're accustomed to it. And so when you go to the Muslim world and you get a different challenge, it can be quite confusing. So I do understand that. But for others, this type of challenge, they would find it unnatural and say, "I don't want to subscribe to this anymore." And they'll go to the Muslim world. And then they'll realize it is hard. But the things that they were looking for as a Muslim, as you said, what this woman was looking for, is something that helps them, and they feel more comfortable being part of the collective.
Sure. Shifting back to some of the Ottoman leaders and like traits that we want to embody. So let's talk about like himma or aspiration, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think the first person that comes to mind when you talk about aspiration is obviously Sultan Mehmed II, right? Is that is he truly the one that embodies that spirit of aspiration amongst the Ottoman sultans, or is there somebody else out there that we're missing that we're kind of sleeping on?
I think Bayezid Yildirim, which is known as the Thunderbolt,
Okay.
and even Murad Khudavandigar before him, who goes into the Balkans. I think the early Ottomans, the exceptional willingness to keep driving and moving forward is something which becomes internalized, at least within the sort of like Ottoman culture, if you want to call it that, the early Ottoman culture, to the point that it becomes internalized by Fatih in some ways. Why Fatih is exceptional, though? I mean, he's a young guy who's part of a worldview in which people forget there are many people converting to Islam.
At that time.
At that time, right? Because the Ottomans have just conquered the Balkans and so forth. And people forget this, that the drive towards Constantinople predominantly is this new group of Muslims who are surrounding Fatih, who are driven to saying, we can do this. And there is a particular zeal.
So new converts. Absolutely. The new convert zeal.
Absolutely. Okay. Absolutely. That's not to say that there wasn't a Turkic component to it.
Sure.
But there is this zeal from the Balkans that's driving them on and saying we can achieve this. And Fatih himself, you have to accept that he is exceptional in that sense, in terms of he has this unique type of drive. Because people don't realize this, that even during the attempts to conquer Constantinople, and even prior to it, there were a lot of naysayers. There are a lot of people saying you can't do this is impossible, this is a forbidden fruit, leave it alone.
Can you really, by the way, elaborate, make an analogy, Constantinople between a city of today's diamond age? Because I don't think people sometimes, forget like how relevant, like what Constantinople was as a city.
I'm not sure in terms of how you can compare it to today's age, but it is the center of Christendom. It is at least in the imagination still, even though it's not the same type of Eastern Roman Empire, but it is, you have to understand, even in the imagination at the time, this was a center of a civilization, right? And in that sense, Constantinople reflected a imagination of the Roman Empire in the way that I don't think sometimes people of today's age can appreciate. Look, when we're talking about Rasul Sallam, let's just say, for example, right?
Yep.
A lot of the battles regarding the early Muslims were against the Byzantines. So imagine how far the Byzantines stretched, right? And that was continuously in the Muslim mind, that this was the obstacle. It wasn't Rome. It was the Byzantines who were continuously restricting the spreading of Islam into that region. And so the imagination of taking the center of it finally by Fatih was exceptional. But what's weird is that, I mean, it's not weird, but there was a faction of doves at the time who were saying, just leave it and let it be, and this is the status quo. We've tried it before. We didn't achieve it. And, why do we need to disrupt the sort of like configuration that we have in terms of the political landscape of the region? And Fatih was like, no, we're going to go for this. And then when they were trying to conquer Constantinople and the ships kept being sunk, there was in the forces themselves, we read about this, that they were in disarray, they were being demotivated. They were saying, look, the Sultan is too young, he's made a mistake, what's going on here? And Fatih turned to his sheikh, Akshamsuddin, and he's like, probably, and I'm speculating, but asking him, like, have we made a mistake? What are we doing? I mean, this idea of despair is in all of us. This is why, I read Surah Duha,
right,
in that sense. And so this is, yes, Fatih is a great leader, but at that moment, you realize he's human too. There's a human component here, and that he's very stoic, but there is a moment that he has his doubts because the conditions show those doubts. But what did they do? I mean, Akshamsuddin says, and we can achieve this, it's possible, keep going, have tawakkul in Allah Ta'ala. They chop down logs, take their boats over the hill. Now, what's interesting here is two things. One, there's a particular level of ingenuity in that community. There's an intelligence in that community that we don't appreciate, that they knew exactly that they need to do this to achieve their end goal. But a second thing, they trusted the leadership. There was a trust in the leader, that the choice he was making, that we should try it. We should go for it. And alhamdulillah, for them, they were successful and they achieved it. And that, I think, says something about the leadership qualities of Fatih too. It's not just the zeal and the himma and so forth. It's the idea that when people say that this is unachievable, and you do get doubts in your head, but there are people at the same time who are giving you advice saying this is possible. And Fatih went with his instinct to some degree and, ignored the naysayers and kept pushing forward.
But also knew where his strengths within his organization was.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Right? I mean, not everyone's not going to be a jack of all, know everything, right?
Absolutely. And when you look at how Fatih look, it's not just the taking of the city. It's the policies that Fatih has, the restructuring of the city, the architectural reconstruction of the city, the Islamization of Istanbul and so forth. Clearly, Fatih and the intelligentsia he has around them are of a particular disposition of recognizing these things. And I think that's what people sometimes miss, that, there is a particular type of intellectual current that's running through that generation of Ottomans. And it's a generational one. It's a young generation. And it's a generation that's able to achieve these sort of changes that was impactful to the point that you have Selim and his ambitions, like Fatih, to go down and take on the Mamluks.
And he was, 19?
Fatih.
Yeah.
They say between 19 to 21. So. And
that's the thing. We're like some 19-year-old. In our day and age, we're like, this is a kid.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when there's a joke in Turkey that fathers always tell their kids, like, you're playing PlayStation and Fatih conquered Constantinople. This is a constant joke. And then kids will say something back to their fathers, like saying, yeah, but, here the whole army behind him who wanted to support him.
They never said, well, if I had a father like Mehmed the First.
Well, look, when you see in the case of Murad and so forth, I mean, no, kids will be kids. But it is interesting in the sense that the early Ottomans, then, what you learn is they have a different conception of what it means to be a man. They have a different conception of how they see power. And that power, although we assume because we're sultanic centered, that it's in the hands of one, but it actually is dependent on a group of people who are your supported aides. We see this in the case of Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Sahaba. So in the Fatih's case, he had multiple people around him who were able to support the type of decisions he wanted to make. And that, I think, is important.
Sure. You briefly mentioned, you said Bayezid also had that similar aspirational traits, right?
He was just unlucky he came against Timurlane, in many ways, because this is why he's called the Thunderbolt, because he was just blitzing principalities really fast. But he believed, clearly, it seems in the case of Bayezid, he had some sort of notion of state building, and that he wanted to create at least be acknowledged, because, when he makes the case to the Khalifa in the Mamluk areas to be recognized as Sultan of Rome, that's a shift from Orhan and Osman, at least, where in his imagination, he's thinking empire in many ways. And so now he gets defeated, and then we have the interregnum. So how does this zeal and imagination still continue? One, it seems like within the family there is still this imagination of that. But two, the ulama and thinkers and people who have bought into the Ottoman culture and worldview still exist, even though Timurlane had totally disbanded the Ottoman Empire. And it's these types of people, when Fatih and Murad come back, that they are able to go again. So what you see is, even though if a state combusts, let's talk about today's Ottoman Empire combusting, the Ummah is still very vibrant. The Muslims are still carrying the ideas of Islam. Yep. The Muslims are still learning and knowledge and so forth. And so that continuation within the Ummah provides the possibility or the re-emergence of something again. And that's what we see in the case of Fatih.
If someone were to do Wikipedia searches on all the Ottoman sultans, right?
Right.
It does seem like Mehmed II, Fatih, was descendant of Osman Ghazi.
Yeah, that's right.
They are right.
Yeah.
So how do we understand? But then we read Ibn Khaldun's theory on generation, the first generation, they built it up, and then the second generation maintained, and the third generation forgot, and there's a downfall, right? It doesn't seem like the Ottomans really had that real dip. There's probably little troughs here and there, but do we have examples of sultans who just showed up and they were just bums?
Yeah, there are many, and some are crazy. What's interesting about Khaldun's theory, the cyclical theory of rise and fall, is that I think Khaldun accepts that time is a variable that you can't guess, but he still tries to put a guesstimation on it by saying roughly 120 years. And that kind of makes sense in Khaldun's case, because if you look at the states around him, whether it's the states of North Africa or the Ilkhanids and so forth, they roughly fit this pattern, roughly. And Bayezid, from Osman to Bayezid, would fit that pattern. So in that sense, from Khaldun's observation, you would have to say you can understand why he made that type of observation. Having said that, the Ottomans survived for another 500 years. Now, how does that happen? One or two things are happening here. Either Khaldun's understanding of time as a variable is something that needs re-examination. That Khaldun, only Allah Ta'ala knows time. And even though Khaldun tried to put a number on time, that looking at Khaldun in theory, we may have to remove that component and say that's not something we can control. And so the Ottomans survived out for 600 years in this one big stretch. Or what we could think of is that the Khaldunian theory was correct, and at roughly every 120 years, the Ottomans had ways of reinventing themselves. The reason why they were able to do that, perhaps, is there's no other principality or dynasty that was able to challenge them. So they could reinvent. So there was a rise and fall in Ottoman society and the polity, but the dynasty remained because it's been able to continuously reinvent in that sense. And you do see these shifts every century to some degree, where the Ottoman state has to make that adjustment. Now, why is this interesting? Because Malik bin Nabi, who I mentioned earlier, the Algerian thinker, he also thinks in cyclical theories, but he talks about civilization.
Right.
So whereas Khaldun is talking about the state, bin Nabi is talking about civilizational rise and fall. And his understanding of civilizational rise and fall is time is a longer stretch. So civilizations take longer to collapse in that sense. And so one of the unique things here is that we might have amalgamated in our minds the Ottomans as a state and a civilization. And that might be a little bit problematic. But why is this important? Because in the case of Western Europe, for example, who are the bastions of Western civilization, they collapsed, but the United States of America took over. So civilizationally, it's a longer stretch in that sense, where other states could take over. In the case of the Ottoman Empire, yes, they collapsed, but Islam as a civilization still continues, and so on. So maybe we might have to look at it differently. And Ben Nabi accepts this. He goes, time is a variable I can't measure, right? And that's because his stretch is longer. But why does this help? I think it helps to some degree to help us understand what's happening in Western civilization right now, where they're at. And I think Gaza has exploded that in our minds in terms of, is Western civilization in trouble? The uniqueness of Western civilization was the fact, or the contemporary Western civilization, was the fact that after World War II, when the Western European states collapsed, the USA was a state that wasn't hurt as much as they were, and was able to continue that culture and that tradition. Whereas in the case of the Ottoman Empire, when it collapses, the Muslim states don't take that energy of wanting to continue that, and they decide to do their own thing, and that's part of the problem. Now, when we're looking at US today, where we at right now, and the uniqueness of the US is if empire collapses here, we're looking at global ramifications, because this is the first time in human history we have an empire that has its fingers in all the pots.
Sure. I'll park. I was going to ask you later about like current affairs and whatnot, but moving on to this other element of like what's obviously a common like fantasy of brothers who, when they examine the Ottoman Sultans, are these harems.
Oh yeah,
right. And I don't know if you've spoken about this elsewhere, but and there's this whole topic of like, behind every a great man's a great woman, and in the case of the sultans, there was probably multiple women, right? Was there any sultan that had less than 2 wives?
So, the early Ottomans are very different than what we start to see the emergence of the Haram culture. Now, why does the Haram culture come about? Now, there are historians, in particular, who have critiqued the way that the fetishization has taken place within the Orientalist mind regarding the Haram. So our imagination of the Haram, unfortunately, even the Muslim imagination, is on the the Orientalist paintings of the Sultan walking into a bathhouse with just naked white women everywhere, right? That's not how it actually worked.
Dang it! I was like, you're breaking my.
That's not how it works at all. I mean, look, this is how you have to understand it. So, the early Ottomans were marrying, and marriage in the way that we understand it today is that a lot of people want to marry for compatibility, a life partner, somebody who's their best friend, so forth, and they want to fall in love with their partner and whatever. But throughout history, those were not conditions for marriage. People married for multiple reasons, and very practical reasons. And the early Ottomans would marry fundamentally for two reasons. One were political reasons, to create political alliances, and the second was for children, to have children to continue the dynasty, right?
Love wasn't a prerequisite.
I mean, it wasn't a requisite in the sense that was a driving factor of why they got married. Now, did they fall in love? We know in the case of Suleiman al-Qanuni that he falls in love with Hurrem, who's known as Roxolana in English. Okay, but that wasn't the requisite of the reason they got married. I mean, I don't know about your parents' case, but my parents, who had an arranged marriage, didn't get married. That love wasn't the requisite there.
Same.
So,
yeah, my parents met each other on the wedding day.
Absolutely.
Right.
So, okay.
Yeah.
So, by the time we get to Fatih in particular, where they've now become an empire, centralized a lot of the regions, there are no more other dynasties or principalities whose you can create political alliances with. It's all yours. So how do you get married? You're not just going to get married to somebody from the street. You're an imperial force. So what you do is you create an institution of women in which you could find a partner from, right? In that sense. And so you create sort of like an area where there are women available who are being trained, perhaps, to be the wives of the Sultan. Now, not all of them became the wives of the Sultan. Some of them then became maids, worked in the palace, went into other spaces within the palace to do other menial jobs and things like that. So that was why it was created. Now, the second reason was, like I said, have children for the principality. And the reason, a lot of these women were slave women, reason being is because they don't have a lineage. And so they wouldn't have a father or brother who could challenge the Ottoman dynasty in terms of its legitimacy of power. So you would maintain that. So that was another reason behind it. Now, do Ottoman sultans have concubines and have relationships with more than one woman and so forth? Yeah, they do. I mean, that is something that happens in that sense. But the harem comes from that type of culture, okay? And that's what it's trying to do, which is it's trying to create an institution and a safe space for the dynasty itself to try to find partners for the sultan. Now, in today's imagination, that might sound weird, but you've got to understand that the palace is like a prison. The sultan cannot just walk outside and just talk to people. So, and, you know, how does the sultan find partners in life in that sense? So they created this type of institution in this way to facilitate those needs.
Sure. So, I mean, one angle could be, as we're talking about it, it's known today in our modern lives that, like, women can be, you know, it's a double-edged sword, right? They can be distraction, because you could see, like, if I have all these women in my harem,
right?
That could be distraction because maybe some of them are crazy. They got beef with each other. They have their own rivalries. Right. And you got to deal with that drama. Yeah. But there's also this issue of, like, sexual anxiety or sexual repression, where at least that part doesn't seem to be like a problem for the Ottoman sultans. Like, they don't have they're not worried. Like you have dudes today that'll become like this whole incel culture. Right. They become bums because they're not getting laid. The sultans didn't have that problem. That wouldn't be that problem, right?
I don't think that would have been a problem for Muslim societies across the board.
Okay.
I think when you look at that part of the world, I mean, marriage was a very practical thing. So people found ways of getting married. You don't see, I mean, I don't know what the optics are, but
today's day and age, what happens is you hear, like, cases of, like, how many, like, all these divorces, people 15, 20 years they've been married, right? A lot of times it's because, you know, after some time, there's no passion in the marriage. They sleep in separate beds, or you know, that kind of thing. That's what I'm talking about. Like, yeah, you can be married, but your needs aren't met.
So in the Ottoman Empire, divorce may have happened just as much as today, but the stigma of getting remarried wasn't a problem.
I see. Yeah.
So in that sense, you know, that wasn't a concern in that sense, and You're right. In the case of the Ottoman Empire and the Sultans, if we're talking about that, so they had that particular familial need catered for. But even wider society, I mean, polygamy was a practice that people did. People did often get married in monogamous ways. And the stipulations and the challenges and the difficulties of marriage were not put on the table in the way that we have today.
Sure.
So marriage was just the normal requisite of everyday life that people did, and and the challenges came with it. But I think today this is my personal opinion. I think the reason why we focus marriage a lot more in terms of a value and ideal is because it's become so difficult. And there are people who are finding it difficult to maintain the marriage, and there are people who find it difficult to get married, right? And that goes back to when we started this discussion about the absence of the village.
Yeah.
And so when things are so intense and dense and sort of like in one space, whether it's a guy behind a laptop or a husband and wife in one apartment, that type of intensity is not something that we're conducive towards. So I'll say this, for example, fundamentally, insan is being created to love Allah Ta'ala and to be consumed by Allah Ta'ala, and then the love of His Messenger, Rasul Sallam. And then insan has been offered to give parts of his love to multiple peoples, not just his spouse. His spouse is just one. His children, his mother, his friends, and so on. Now, when you distribute your love accordingly across the board in that way to your village, it's a lot more wholesome. But when that village is removed from you, and the only person that you can provide your love towards is this now tight, narrow conception of your spouse or your children, and that's it. To some degree, it's kind of unnatural, and it makes it very intense, the emotions, and so it makes the relationships intense in some ways. And once again, this is something that we might need to consider.
So you mentioned something. So could we say that maybe one of the issues, really, the modern Muslim man, for example, mm-hmm. because they have less people, right? Mm-hmm. They're not getting from their spouse, or they're not married at all. Mm-hmm. But could we say that a lot of it is because they have not understood the love that they need to have towards Allah and the Messenger of Allah, ﷺ, and the lack of focus there, or that love leads to other issues?
It's a good question. I don't know. I mean, it's something I need to think about and reflect on. But what I can say to you is that we do need to rethink about how we have established our relationship with Allah Ta'ala. It's not for us to determine what relationship we have with Allah Ta'ala. It's for Allah Ta'ala to determine what relationship we have with Him, right? And in that sense, He created us for the sole purpose of worshipping Him. And if you sort of like negate that to some degree, it leads to misery, for sure. And I feel like, I've spoken to friends of mine and so on, and they will tell me, look, the Muslims in the West, they don't feel like they've got agency. And I say, what concerns me is they've forgotten that Allah Ta'ala has agency and has the ultimate agency. And so there is something in us in which, for many of us, who the everyday grind of life seems to segregate us from our connection to Allah Ta'ala. And the reason why we pray 5 times a day, and the reason why we do adhkar, and the reason why we do dua, and the multiple different forms of ibadat, from the clothing we wear to fasting to our behavior, is to remind us of the centrality of Allah Ta'ala, because insan forgets. And it's unbelievable that insan will pray Salat al-Fajr, remembering Allah Ta'ala, and as soon as Salat al-Fajr is done, they forget Him. And they go into their daily lives. That's just the way we are. And so Allah Ta'ala knows that about us. But this is why we have so many extra sunan as a way of continuously trying to remember Him, because He should be central to the way that we see ourselves, our disposition. Now, the modern life that we have right now, where we're spinning so many plates, it makes it very difficult, because the human being in of themselves has multiple distractions, whether it's the iPhone, to work, to paying the bills. Everything is just dragging insan away from what they've been put here to do, which is to worship their Creator.
Sure. So coming full circle now, right? We started the podcast talking about Sultan Abdul Hamid's piety, right?
Right.
So what can we learn from his like maybe day-to-day practices? Because you said he was confined, like most sultans were confined to the palace.
Right.
You said you were telling me that he only went for Salatul Jum'ah. He left the palace.
That's right.
So what kind of personal practices, like, so he prayed Salatul Fajr, but then what do we know about him that kept him like conscious throughout the day? Like what are some of those lessons maybe someone today can take?
He went the full 9 yards, like as you say in this country. I mean, it's like for Sultan Abdul Hamid is, so we say this all the time, like if the Muslim is just doing the bare minimum,
Yep.
then they're going to get the bare minimum,
Right.
in terms of how they feel. And this is why we are encouraged to be as wholesome as we can, to do as much as we can. And Abdul Hamid II was driven by that. And I think that imagination that you presented to me in the beginning about Sultan Abdul Hamid in that scene, I think what they're attempting to capture there is the idea that Sultan Abdul Hamid was continuously thinking about his deen and his place in it. And that Abdul Hamid was concerned about his relationship with Allah Ta'ala and concerned regarding his love for Rasulullah. And the fact that if there was a moment where he slipped on that was something which was traumatic for him. Mm. And so whether it's true or not true, but there's enough in the way that we read about Sultan Abdul Hamid that indicates towards this being something of his personality, perhaps. Now, like I said, the creators of the show might have used some creative liberty, but the sentiment, what they're trying to get to, at least, is that about the Sultan. And I think to some degree, look, he wasn't perfect. He made many mistakes, but I don't think, from my understanding of the reading of history at least, that one can question his sincerity towards his love of Allah Ta'ala and Rasulullah. Now, there were ulama who critiqued him in terms of the way that he did his politics, perhaps, and so on. But but I think we have to be a little fair to Abdul Hamid II.
Sure. We got like about 10 minutes left, and I got two quick fire things I want to get with you. So, you briefly mentioned current affairs today. So, as a historian, how do you view the events of October 7th and what's happening today? This quick change, because I think on a previous podcast you did with like Thinking Muslim with Muhammad Jalal, I think you said a phrase about the Ottomans took back Jerusalem after only 80 years or something of that sort, right? 80 years for us seems like a long time, but in grand scheme of history. But anyways, we just want to, as a historian, through your lens, what can we? How are you interpreting what's going on today with like Gaza and everything?
Yeah, so I think if I remember carefully, it was about the gap between the Crusaders and Salahuddin was like this 90-year stretch, right?
Okay.
And then the Crusaders had, they had conquered Beit al-Maqdis longer than the Israeli occupation.
Right.
In that sense. Yes, it's a different time and so forth. But what we learn from this is this idea of how the Ummah is going to keep working and be steadfast, and it's a generational steadfast. So I think I mentioned in Jalal's podcast when I recited Surah Nasr in there, and I said that, Surah Nasr in the mud in Iza Ja, the elongation in that section, Iza Ja Nasrullahi wal Fath, which is that there's an indication of steadfastness. Some of the ulama say that you have to be steadfast, and then Allah Ta'ala, the Nasr of Allah Ta'ala comes, and then comes the Fath, the opening, right? And that this steadfastness could be generational, perhaps, right? And so the Muslim has to not lose their vigor, not lose their hope, and not assume that this is a defeat, like in the way of Hudaybiyah, that this could be the moment of the Nasr of Allah Ta'ala. And I spoke to you about the agency of Allah Ta'ala,
right, in
that sense. And when you look at the Palestinians, they fundamentally believe in the supremacy of Allah Ta'ala and His agency.
So those of us in the West, sometimes we feel like the Americans are too much, the lobby's too strong. That's the kind of sentiment you hear a lot. Yeah, it's impossible.
Right, and so this is why yesterday, when I was talking about Surah Al-Qasas, and we see in the case of Musa alayhi salam,
right,
that Musa alayhi salam was born and raised in the house of Fir'aun. Mm-hmm. He understood the culture, the supremacy, the power, and yet Allah Ta'ala took him out of that. First put him in that place, then took him out of it and made him prophet. And then Musa alayhi salam was stripping away the authority of Fir'aun by exposing his lies, because they were into sorcery at the time, and saying that what you're showing me are fabrications, are falsehoods. which is the whole point of Tawheed in some ways, which is that there's exposing falsehood and then there's highlighting that Allah Ta'ala is the only truth in that sense, right? And this is what Musa alayhi salam is doing. And so he's taken it away from them, because the most powerful thing that any form of authority can do is create a perception of its supremacy, which is a foundational lie, because supremacy belongs to Allah Ta'ala. So why does this surah become important? Because it resonates with Rasul Sallam, because he's doing exactly the same in regards to the Quraysh. He was born in the household of the Quraysh. He understood that power, that so forth, and they were exercising a particular type of supremacy. Now, unlike him exposing the lies of the Quraysh via Musa alayhi salam having a staff, he does it via the Quran, right? And Allah Ta'ala says in this surah, in Surah Al-Qasas, regarding the Quran, which is, he said, I would have shown you a miracle, but you would not have believed it like the people before. So this now, I bring you the Quran so that you may hear and comprehend what you're doing. They deny it. They too fall apart. Now, why is Surah Qasas important here now? Because we Muslims who understand global hegemony have been raised in the hegemonic world of the Pharaoh, of the Quraysh, are now seeing that every single lie that their empire was predicated on is being stripped away piece by piece, bit by bit, in the way Pharaoh's authority was taken apart, and of the Quraysh. And it didn't happen overnight. But once those layers were being taken away, once Allah Ta'ala was exposing those lies, then what happened is fundamentally the followers of Musa alayhi salam turned to him. The followers of Rasul salam turned to him. And you would hope now that the Ummah would turn back to their deen, turn back to Allah Ta'ala, because the supremacy is in that. The moral and ethics are in that. And so in this moment in time where we're seeing a difficulty, I've said this before and I said this in Jalal's podcast, now's the time to be Muslim. Now's the time for Islam to show itself as the moral and ethical alternative to the way that we're living in the world right now. The lies of the media, the lies of the politicians, the lies of Hollywood, the lies of the universities, every single fabric of Western civilization is being exposed. And I think that is it's not unique because it's done it before, but we should be able to see it in our current lens.
Sure. Well, hey, as we wrap up here, you told me that this may be the last. This won't be maybe the last podcast we record, but this may be the last podcast that actually airs. Because I will need a couple of weeks, or I always say that, a couple of weeks to edit in terms of like longer than that. But what's going on? Why are you going off the grid?
So we spoke about this before. I mentioned to you that I've been diagnosed very late in life as being ADHD, and I'm fine. And throughout my life, I struggled with that without not really knowing what it was, and it was a huge challenge for me. And as I've got older, I've just become very exhausted.
Were you diagnosed like within the last year?
Within the last few months.
Oh, okay. So when we spoke last year, you didn't know yet.
No, absolutely. Now,
I got you.
Look, as a child, I've always known that something quirky is happening.
Sure.
Like it's a neurological issue. It's not a psychological one. The extreme fatigue, the exhaustion, the paralysis. It's not an issue of you having an attention deficit. It's an excessive amount of attention that you have.
Okay.
And now at this age in my life, the more popular I'm becoming because of these mediums, the more impossible it's becoming for me to live a life of normality in which I can safeguard myself mentally and physically. And that's very tough for me because I'm an introvert. It's very strange for me to be walking down the streets of London and somebody coming up to me and go, "Are you that YouTube guy?" and then saying, "Can we take a picture?" Right? It's very strange for me to go into a masjid and people see you like a celebrity, which I am not. And I'm not that person. And I don't want to be that person. And I just felt to myself that I need to strip away from this. That there is something, unfortunately, caustic in the modern world in which we feel the need to be visible in everyone's lives every single day. And that if we are not visible via social media or any other means in the lives of other people, that somehow we're not valid as human beings. And I want to have a better connection with Allah Ta'ala. I want to go back to having a better relationship with my family and a better relationship with myself and my ilm, which has been hurt a little bit because it's harder for me to write because of the circuit, which I'm not accustomed to. And this is going to sound strange to some of your viewers perhaps, but I don't have a good relationship with money either. I'm not driven by capital in some ways. I'm driven by just having some sort of level of peace and tranquility. I'm a child at heart. You take me into a toy shop and I get excited and I'm done with that. But, you know, like when I was in the masjid yesterday and you just seen the eyes are on you. And as an introvert, that's tough for me. I have to come out of my shell and present. And so a lot of this culture, which is the norm for many people who want to do da'wah, is difficult for me of a person who wants to focus on ilm. And I just thought maybe it's time to strip it away. And I hope if your viewers watch this, and I hope that they go a bit easy on me, because there have been many people in the community who want to amplify my visibility, feeling that, you know, that they feel I should be doing more and that there's more young kids that want to listen to me and I'm different and I'm a fresh voice. But I hope that they can appreciate that it's really hard for me. And I'm not trying to be, well, maybe I'm being a little bit selfish, but in order to be able to give my students the sort of like intense relationship that I have with them, which is a personal one, in order to be able to give my family. And if you look in the past, historically, the ulama were never exposed to this sort of magnitude of explosion. And even now in the Muslim world, the ulama don't operate in this way. There's a reason why it's important to be local and grounded and so on. And so I just want to go back to that. So, you know, that's
if people want to benefit from you, there are avenues still for
that. Oh,
that,
absolutely.
Right?
So I say to people, I'm a recluse and I'm private, but I'm not rude. You know, if you reach out to me, I'm going to do everything in my power to try to help you.
Right.
And I'm sure that throughout the next few years, from time to time, I'll turn up to a masjid and give a talk. I still feel compelled to try to support the community in every shape or form. But just the explosion of this celebrity culture, that's just not me.
So here's what I'll say, right? I think that you've given people a little taste with these podcasts and stuff,
right?
But people need to go a little deeper, and you're available for that. You teach through Qasas.
That's right.
That's where your meat is, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So I mean, that's where people should go. And what's the website? Al-Qasas is alqasas.org.
It's .org. That's right. Yeah. So for anyone who doesn't know, that was a platform that we established as a way of trying to teach Islamic history.
Right.
And we're on the process of trying to get more Muslim historians to go on that platform, because as I mentioned before, I feel like we have a particular level of collective amnesia. As Muslims, and is not having a attachment to a historical past written by Muslims for Muslims, it creates a type of dislocation which is very caustic for us. And so at the moment we're in a formative stage of Muslims going into academia and so forth, but the long-term hope would be, especially after what I'm seeing what's happening in Western universities, is Muslims find ways of creating newer spaces of learning to teach Muslims. And it doesn't need to have a certificate. We're trying to give you ilm so that you can shape yourself as a character.
Right.
And so we're trying to encourage more and more people, not simply to be students, but people who want to teach and take on and do syllabi and curricula and so on.
Well, the incentive there for people who are fans of Dr. Yakoob, you can still take your courses through, interact with you through that forum.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do it on your terms. That's what I'm saying. And I think it's fair.
I appreciate that. Yeah. So, like I said, and even on, like teaching on Zoom and so forth, there is still a distance there. But I try to be as personal as I can still with the students to the best of my ability. What I would prefer is to be in this type of setting, right? But having said that, alhamdulillah, like when I've gone around the world, people have given me a lot of respect. And I don't know if I deserve that, to be honest with you. I haven't done much for that, but I'm grateful to Allah Ta'ala. Like yesterday when I was presented in the masjid, this sounds bizarre, but I just kept telling Allah Ta'ala, please give me inspiration where I don't forget, because I forget a lot of things, and please do not allow me to be humiliated in public. I'm just trying to convey a message, and I have many limitations in that sense, and there are far more better people than me in this sort of culture that they can do the work that they need to do.
Well, Dr. Yakoob, was always a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
I definitely consider you a friend now.
Thank you.
After me,
so likewise.
You know what I'm saying?
Well, you're my brother.
For sure.
You're my brother. It's a
one of my bucket list items is maybe you and I can go to a Man United Liverpool game one day.
Inshallah. Inshallah. And we'll see Man United lose. That'd be great. That'd be great.
All right. For our listeners out there, if you have any questions or comments, you can email me at info@sultansandsneakers.com. I'm also available on all the various social media apps. You can listen to the show on the audio podcast platforms such as Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google, or watch on YouTube. For my special guest, Dr. Yakoob Ahmed, I'm your host, Mahinda Podcaster, signing off. Assalamu alaikum.